Jenny McLachlan has always loved reading and writing, and after studying English at university, she became an English secondary school teacher. This encouraged her to keep writing at home, but it wasn't until she attended the Winchester Writers' Festival in 2013 that she plucked up the courage to send her work to an agent. Her title, Flirty Dancing, became the first in a 4-part series for teenagers, but she's since turned her hand to books for younger children, including her latest title, The Land of Raw. Jenny talked to Nikki Gamble about her work and future plans.
Of course, you've been writing for some time and you've written quite a lot of young adult or teenage fiction. But before you were a writer, I think you had a job that will connect with many of our listeners. I understand that you were a teacher.
I was a teacher for 14 years and I taught English, there's a surprise, at secondary school. And actually just when I got my contract to write my first books, I'd just become head of English. So as you can imagine, that didn't work very well with having to write a book in 6 months. But I did it.
Yes. Yeah.
And then I stopped being a teacher.
Wouldn't want to do it again, but I did it.
No, I don't know how I did it. Probably relied on my family a lot.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, there was a big carrot dangling.
So what was it that attracted you to writing? Was it something, most people have been writing in the background before they become published. So were you collecting things in a bottom drawer?
Well, I mean, I imagine that most people who go to university, study English and become English teachers absolutely adore reading. So that's been a constant throughout my entire life. Something I've always loved reading has been a part of my life. But I don't think, it was possibly a secret wish to become a writer, but I don't think I really had the confidence when I was younger to do it. And that grew gradually. And it's interesting because I started writing, I think there were a couple of things that sort of pushed me more towards writing. One was the fact that my husband's also an English teacher. So when we used to go on holiday, we'd write for fun. What did 2 English teachers do on holiday? We used to write mini sagas. And then teaching made me become a writer, I think, because there were 2 reasons. Modelling became a big thing in the classroom, and I really enjoyed modelling, and I really enjoyed demonstrating how you could create suspense or create comedy, and I probably enjoyed it a little bit too much. I'd get a bit carried away, so I'd be there writing away and I'd be thinking, well, I'm enjoying writing so much, perhaps I should be doing more of it. But then I think that you also need that, because writing your first book takes a long time, and there are a lot of moments when you want to give up. So something that burns inside you, the message you really want, some story you've got to tell. And my first book was about a very shy girl surviving secondary school, and it probably won't be surprised to know that I was a very shy teenager. And I noticed that some of my students, particularly the girls, were shy in a way that I was, and I really wanted to write a book about overcoming that shyness, and so that was the sort of starting point for my first book, really.
It's interesting, isn't it? Secondary school can be such a difficult place for so many of us, and like you, I don't think I fitted easily into that place. So it's interesting that we both went back to teaching. I think my own inspiration was to be the teacher that I didn't have. Right. Was that the same for you, or was there another motivation?
I suppose that I very much wanted my classroom, well, I wanted children's experience in school all the time to be like this, but I could control my classroom to feel safe and fun and relaxed and creative. Because my memories of being at secondary school were being tense and being not wanting to be myself, hiding who I actually was most of the time to be some sort of acceptable version of myself. And I loved, I suppose, in teaching, getting to know the students and trying to create an atmosphere where they could be who they actually were.
Fascinating. It really chimes with me, that notion, and there must be lots of young people out there who feel that they can't be themselves. So anyway, from that to writing and on to thinking about your most recent novel, The Land of Raw, I wanted to start with the dedication, actually, which says, it's for your girls, my girls, who never stopped believing in raw. So I'm guessing that there is a story here, a family story behind the creation of this book.
Well, I suppose it's both thank you to my daughters for inspiring me through their playing and reminding me of the innovative and imaginative ways in which children play when I was watching them growing up, but also the fact that they did literally believe in this book and this story. And there were times when I nearly stopped writing it, and my oldest daughter would say to me, she had absolute confidence that it was going to be published and that it was going to be great. It was very touching. She hasn't had that confidence with all my books, but with this one she just kept saying, it's going to be great, Mum, it's going to be great, you've just got to do it, you've got to do it. And she was so confident. So there were the two things, but watching them play was very powerful as well, because I love the way that there's such a thin dividing line between reality and fantasy when you're young. So if you watch children play, they could pick up maybe like a spoon and a fork, and it could become a game, and they would be talking to each other. And then there comes that point when it stops working. So mine are at the point, my youngest one's at the point now where I'm not allowed in the room when she's playing, because it becomes harder to enter that fantasy world, that make-believe world. And I can also remember my older daughter once making a castle out of those great big Lego bricks, the big chunky ones. So although it was big, it wasn't big enough to contain a 3-year-old child, so she made this castle and she said, now I'm going to get in it. She wanted to go inside the castle, so she tried to get into this castle, and the look of disappointment on her face when she realised, I can't get into the game.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if you could?
Isn't that interesting? So, Jenny, I wonder if you could just set the story up for us. Tell us, without giving too much away, just tell us, lead us in.
Well, there are two children, twins, Arthur and Rose, and they are 11 and on the brink of starting secondary school. I can remember this period in my own life very vividly. Rose is keen to grow up and start secondary school, and has no interest in playing with her twin brother Arthur, who does still want to keep playing. He's sort of more rooted in those games. He loves playing with his sister. Anyway, they go to stay with their granddad, who they do this every year, and they love being at his house because it offers total freedom. They can do whatever they like there. And when they're there, Grandad decides they're going to clear out the attic, and in the process they start to discover some strange things. A map they made when they were very younger that shows a land called Raw, and then a folding camp bed with the words "Enter here for the land of Raw" scratched on the top. And the memories start to come back to the children of a game they used to play in the attic that was the best game they ever played. And the game began when they crawled through the folding camp bed. And Rose wants to have nothing to do with this memory and this game, whereas Arthur is intrigued and a little bit frightened by it because some strange things start to happen. Now, Grandad's really keen to encourage this sense of play in his grandchildren, so he crawls into the bed and then promptly vanishes.
I think that's a good cue for a reading.
Okay. So I'm going to read the chapter when Arthur decides he has no choice, because he can't find his granddad anywhere, but to go follow him into the bed and look for him. I pull my legs in behind me and I crouch in the middle of the bed just like before, only this time I don't bother with any magic words. Instead, I use Rose's technique. I close my eyes and I imagine Raw. It's hard to begin with. Raw is buried at the back of my mind. Some details, like Wynn's hat and Croaky's voice, are crystal clear, but most of it is hazy and muddled, like my memories of Nanny and the first house we ever lived in. But then something comes back to me, a feeling of holding a soft creature in my hands. This thing has got wings and they're batting against my fingers. Furry. I'm holding a furry. I'm not exactly sure what a furry is, but suddenly I know there were loads of them in Raw. Then my mind is full of furries. I see them hovering like dragonflies and sunbathing on stones, and Raw comes rushing back to me as fast as the furry's beating wings. I see me and Wynn standing on a ship, the Raven, and I feel the spray from the bottomless ocean stinging my eyes. I hear a shout to my left, "Get back before he burns your hair off!" And I turn to see Rose tossing bits of donut to a hovering dragon. Croaky lands with a thump on the deck of the Raven. His black wings billow around him like a cloud as he grips hold of my arm and hisses, "I've got you now, Arthur Trout." Keeping my eyes squeezed shut and my mind stuffed full of Raw, I start to crawl further into the mattress. Left hand, right hand. I see Mitch, her blue hair trailing behind her, tangled and crusted with shells. Left hand, right hand. I smell the bonfire and popcorn smell of Weninja's cave. left hand, right hand. Somewhere at the back of my brain, I register that I should have fallen onto the attic floor by now, and that this is taking far too long. But I push the thought away and picture Raw's night sky crammed so full of stars, it looked like a bag of glitter had been thrown across black velvet. There were millions of stars in Raw, blue, green, pink, purple, and their light was as warm as the sun. Those stars used to shine down on me and Rose when we were floating in Mitch's lagoon. They made patterns on our skin. I freeze, snapping back to where I am. But something has changed. My hands aren't pressing into a soft, spongy mattress anymore. They're touching something cold and hard. Holding my breath, I feel around. The mattress has gone. I'm kneeling on stone. Icy fear rushes through me. This is what I wanted to happen, wasn't it? I wanted to crawl into the camp bed and for something magical to happen. But now rock is digging into my hands and knees. I'm so scared, my whole body is shaking. I force myself to open my eyes. Thick blackness surrounds me, but far ahead I can just make out a tiny pinprick of green light. And the air isn't dusty anymore. It's cool and damp, and I can hear rushing water. I start to crawl towards the green light. My head scrapes against the roof of the tunnel, and rocks graze my hands. But I don't stop until I reach the very end, and the green light has become a curtain of leaves, with light shining through it. Before I can change my mind, I push my head through the leaves and crawl into dazzling sunshine. I blink and rub my eyes. I'm on a narrow ledge. I lean forward and see that the ledge is set into a cliff, and far below me is a deep, round pool. Trying to ignore the terrifying drop, I look straight ahead. I'm staring across a valley with a river winding through it. The river passes forests and mountains and glittering lakes. One side of the valley is bright and alive and bursting with leaves and colour, while the other side is shadowy and barren. The river has a shifting, swirling rainbow shine on its surface, and it leads to a wild sea. Far, far away, beyond the sea, are snow-topped mountains. Gazing at this unbelievable sight, I should feel lost and scared. But I don't, because this is Raw.
So, a couple of things to ask you about that. First of all, I think that has to be one of the most unusual portals into another world that I've read about in the novel, like a manky old mattress.
Yeah.
So
where the opposite of the wardrobe, basically.
So where did that come from?
Well, you probably won't be surprised to know it was literally lifted from my childhood, though unfortunately it wasn't a portal to a fantasy world in my childhood. My nan was, in a way, a little bit similar to the granddad in this book, and she lived in Portsmouth and had this house that it was not posh, but it was big. So it had cellars and attics, and it was sort of this tall house. And my memory of going to stay there with my cousins and my brother and sister is that the grown-ups would vanish into a room and we would be left to do whatever we wanted. You know, we could play. We used to play with my dead great-granddad's tools in the cellar.
Wow.
We would come up and we'd say, look what we've made. We'd be using saws, and we also, my great-grandmother's might have been her, I think it might have been her pickled onions were down there, and we used to dare each other to eat these pickled onions. But in the attic was a Z bed. Actually, when I wrote the book, I called it a Z bed, so I have to really train myself not to say it. And we did used to dare each other to crawl through the middle, and I remember it being genuinely terrifying. Wow. And it seemed like a long journey to actually get through it and get to the other end, and shaking with fear as I put my head inside and crawled through.
Wow. And actually both attics and cellars appear in your story, don't they, as places to explore. The land of Raw won't escape most readers, I guess, that's probably made up from Rose and Arthur.
That's right.
So what came first, the characters' names or the name of the land?
I was asked this the other day, and I think that unless I changed one of their names to make it work, whatever happened, it was almost the day I thought of it, because I have no memory of changing their names to make Raw. So unless I thought I want the land to belong to them,
that's fascinating.
Should be, or it might have been a brilliant coincidence.
Yeah.
I can't remember. It wasn't that long ago, was it? But I can't remember.
That just goes to show, doesn't it, how writing is this mystery, and we're never quite sure of how these things came about.
Pieces of the jigsaw puzzle have come together.
There are echoes of other stories in there. You know, Grandad feels a little bit like the uncle in Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It feels a little like Bridge to Terabithia. Were these books that were important to you when you were growing up?
Yes, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. What's really interesting, isn't it, because there are key scenes that are so powerful. The Turkish delight scene. They're so powerful that a couple of Christmases ago I sourced some sort of very posh Turkish delight because I needed to recreate the experience of knowing what they were imagining Turkish delight tasted like. But it was very exciting. I just needed snow and a witch and a carriage and furs. But what I found was really interesting, because I read it again after I'd written Raw, because I was really interested in the movement from the real world to the fantasy world, which is hard. I found that very hard because you don't want to lose that sense of realism, but particularly because my book's written in the first person, you can't gloss over it with a sentence of Arthur looked around, was amazed, and then I have to show how Arthur genuinely feels because it's written in the first person. And when I read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, bang, they're in there, aren't they? Just it's so effortlessly done. It's perfection.
That's one of the things that I wanted to explore with you, because I think one of the things that your book does that's quite different from any other stories where children go through a portal into an imaginary or fantasy world is that there's this notion of a memory of a world that was created some time before. And so that needing to build that up is quite different, isn't it, from discovering it for the first time. So getting that balance between the building up and then being in that world, you've already kind of hinted that you had to do some thinking around that. Tell me a little bit about the process of getting to this place.
It was hard. It took a long time. I can't have too many I remember when, there can't be too much remembering. That's not fun when you're reading a book. You want to be at the heart of the action. So I hope I got the balance right, but the opening chapters up to the point where they crawl through the Z bed, Arthur crawls through the Z bed, were a delicate balancing act, I'd say. And
there's a real feeling of suspense through that, which of course starts from, I think we can say this because it's fairly early on in the book, where Arthur looks up and sees what he thinks is
I think it's the first sentence
in the
so you can definitely say it. He sees the outline of a wizard in his granddad's attic. Originally it began, and I come from Eastbourne, which might explain why it began here, on the pier with Arthur on the slot machine, seeing the shadow of Wynne behind him. And actually Nikki Singer suggested that I needed to get straight into the action. It'd be much better if it began in Grandad's house, so I've got her to thank for the wizard in Grandad's attic.
The thing is that the memory aspect is really important to what you're saying in this story, which is that we can lose this capacity for imaginative play. And the age that these children are, they're 11, they're just about to start secondary school. And so there's something here about hanging on to, preserving that.
I can remember very clearly being expected to, not by my mum or dad obviously, but just having this general sense that it was time to stop playing and not wanting to, and carrying on in secret. And it was very useful because I had a little sister who was 6 years younger than me, so by looking after her I could keep playing. And then I think that I transferred that to drawing. And then I probably transferred it to teaching. That allowed me to keep playing, if you like, and then writing as well. So I think it's very, very important.
There's a lot in there, actually. One of the questions I've put here is about drawing and play. There's obviously map making within this story. I wondered whether drawing was part, you've answered it partly, but whether drawing was an important part of your play, and in what way drawing is a playful act.
As I was walking here to meet you today, I was thinking about my childhood, and I felt much comfier in fantasy worlds, whether it was drawing or reading or playing, than I did in the real world. And I was very aware that some people seem much happier in the real world than in fantasy worlds. And I think drawing is... I spent hours and hours drawing much more time. I spent a lot more time drawing than writing when I was young. I didn't particularly enjoy writing because I found spelling difficult. It made my hand ache, and I couldn't get down the ideas that were in my head onto paper. They didn't work. I'd have this idea for a story, but after a page, the character hadn't even got out of bed, and my hand ached too much to carry on. So whereas drawing allowed me to recreate those fantasy worlds much more quickly, and I definitely used a lot of that when I was a teacher to help with writing. And one of my workshops I do is children make their own map of their own fantasy world, and I was try these things out on my children, and they had a friend round, and we started making maps. And what was really intriguing was that they didn't want me to have anything to do with it, of course. I always want to get involved, so I was doing my own map. But listening to them talk, and they start to narrate what they're drawing and make up stories instinctively. Whereas I think if I'd put a piece of paper in front of them and said, write a story about fantasy world.
Is that drawing collaboratively, working on the same drawing or working individually?
Where we do, we're not the same drawing, but side-by-side drawing, and I think that used to work well when I was teaching as well, working side-by-side. I think it took the pressure off if I was doing what they were doing as well. So I might do it on the board or just sit at my desk and do it, whatever they were doing at the same time.
So I have to ask you then, Jenny, when you were writing Land of Raw, did you do the map making for this?
Well, I did. I had a map, and actually I claimed I'd just casually drawn it, but I didn't. I drew one version, and then I drew a second, better version.
And did that help you with the writing, or did you draw the map after you drew the story?
No, but I was probably about not afterwards, but during it, and it definitely helped me. It helped me have an understanding of where things were, and I also do draw characters and scenes just to help me. It comes alive, it runs in my head like a fully realised, I suppose a film's the best way to describe it, and it begins hazy and vague, and then all the details fall into place, and it's just there.
I did want to ask you about this. You say some interesting things about fear as well in this, and there is a real sense of jeopardy there. I mean, it's not completely, there's dark and there's light, but I think at one point you say when we used to play we felt fear. No, you're talking about different types of fear. Exciting, like going on a roller coaster or listening to a ghost story, and then the fear that he's actually feeling in this land, this kind of real, not terror but real fear. How important is that, do you think, in children's books, that we do allow the fear to feel real?
I think it's very important. When I think about the books that I used to read, they're a rehearsal, aren't they, for life? I think that's what they were for me anyway when I was a child, and I read books, and you see other characters experiencing emotions that you maybe have felt and how they deal with them. And if you think about something like Peter Pan, that's really frightening, and the pirates are really frightening pirates with proper weapons, and the Lost Boys are actually quite frightening as well. I don't doubt that would get past the editors these days, but for good reasons for some things. But I do think it's important to have the fear. I mean, I probably felt the most scared I've ever felt was when I was probably around secondary school age. And it's interesting, isn't it, because as an adult you develop coping strategies. But you can feel quite alone and scared, I think, when you're young. I
think one of the things that we probably want to do is to raise brave children. And when I was reading that in your book, I thought, that's interesting, because unless you experience fear, how can you raise brave children?
Yeah, well, you do want to manage your children's experiences, don't you, I think, and you can't. You've got to let them fall over.
I guess stories are a way of, to some extent, of experiencing that vicariously, at least.
Yes, and I mean, Arthur is quite an anxious boy, and I suppose part of the story is about him overcoming his anxiety and his fears, and realising that without needing to change, he does have bravery inside him.
Yeah. Tell us about some of the scary things These scarecrows are quite scary. They don't scare crows, but they are scary.
I'm sure that the scarecrow thing began with Wurzel Gummidge.
Really?
I was terrified of Wurzel Gummidge, weren't you? I mean, who wasn't? So that was possibly in the crackly sound he made.
Yeah.
And the bird fear. I love birds, but my auntie has a bird phobia after my uncle had some tame bird and it landed on her hair and wouldn't come out. So she's always had a dramatic bird phobia, and birds are everywhere. So I think that's possibly where croaky began. But I think that the things that I was probably scared of when I was a teenager were other people my age, and that croaky's mannerisms, if you like, that cold, hard stare, the making people feel very uncomfortable and exposed, that probably comes a little bit more from real life.
Yeah. It's fair to say that although there is a sense of real jeopardy and fear in there, that it's not without its moments of light and humour too. So tell us a little bit about that.
I can't not write comedies, I don't think. Before I wrote my first children's book, teenagers book, I spent years trying to write a very serious book set just before the First World War, a bit like The English Patient, and I've got bags full of research and notes, and I tried and I tried and I tried and I couldn't do it. And as soon as I started to write a comedy using the voice of a teenage girl, I was off. You know when you find your voice. So I think this is I'm sure I think I've got more confidence now to try to use different voices, but I love writing comedy. I just love it.
And the dark is sometimes darker when you've got the light next to it, isn't it? And the light is lighter when you've experienced the dark, I guess.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it makes those moments more moving in the book, possibly. Comedy's there. Yeah,
the relationship with Grandad is lovely, and I think you've hinted to some extent that this is drawn out of family. Tell us a little bit more about Grandad.
Grandad trusts children, doesn't he? He leaves them alone, and he leaves them alone to play and gives them this brilliant freedom. And I definitely had that when I was growing up. I mean, my mum was a very busy person. She didn't get down on her hands and knees and play with me, but she let me play by ignoring me, possibly. But no, it takes, if we said to my mum, can we turn all of the downstairs of the house into a den? She'd say yes. She was so much fun, and she was a head teacher in the end, and she was like that at school. I think if anybody said, can we do this? Can we do that? Yes. She was a lot of fun in that respect, and she still is actually. She loved bonfires, so Grandad's love of bonfires is very connected to that, often in unfortunate places. But she used to do something called Magical Mystery Tour, where we would sit in the back of the car. I realise now it was just like a cold rainy day, what can we do? And we would be blindfolded. My brother and I would be blindfolded. My mum would drive around Eastbourne.
Imagine if somebody had seen that.
I know, 2 children blindfolded in the back of a car. And she'd do things to try and confuse us, so drive sort of 3 times round a roundabout, and then she'd stop the car and say, guess where we are. And we'd have to guess where we are. And the fun came from being in this most unexpected place that we could imagine. So on top of Beachy Head, or once we were actually on the prom, and we both, Mum, we're on the prom. And so yes, she was a lot of fun.
It's unusual, but perhaps less so now than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, that a novel of the size of Land of Raw is actually heavily illustrated. Obviously when you were writing it, you have a particular vision in your head. So what's the experience like of having your story illustrated? The pictures, we should say, are by Ben Mantle.
Well, my dream job would probably be to be an illustrator. And so I was so excited when I knew that I was going to have an illustrated book. Because that was how Egmont decided to package it, and I was absolutely thrilled, because I know the power of illustrations in stories, and when children are looking on to look at the pictures, and I know they've come to see me and they've told me their favourite pictures and the ones they can't stop looking at. So I actually felt sort of nervous each time I'd get an email with some images for me to look at as I looked at them. But I can vividly remember getting the image of the front cover and opening it and having full body tingles. Look at the sight of the dragon staring down at this little figure with all the smoke billowing out of its head. I think that very, very quickly the illustrations become sort of one with the book. And now, of course, when I'm writing, I'm imagining Ben's illustrated characters.
Has it changed the way that you write in any way?
Well, interestingly, I think he's probably... there are a lot of things that I said I can visualise every aspect of the bucket of blood, but actually the characters, particularly Arthur, because I imagine, strangely, I am Arthur when I'm writing, so I don't have much of a sense of what Arthur is like. So I think it actually helps me write it in some ways, because I've now got this, I don't. That's probably the last thing I think about is what the characters actually look like.
That's interesting. No, I think that's really interesting because. When I was trying to think of the characters' names, Rose comes to my head really quickly. Arthur less so, and I think it's because he's writing in the first person.
Yeah, it's not mentioned
so you don't refer to yourself as much, do you?
No.
And so I suppose what the illustrations give is both an internal and an external perspective when you look at it alongside the writing.
It's all through Arthur's eyes, isn't it? You need to look in a reflective pool to see himself.
Interesting.
It is.
Of all the characters in here, whether it's Prosecco, the horse, or the dragons, or Croaky, which character did you enjoy writing the most?
The whole book is so much fun to write. And when I'm planning, I can't stop going into the dialogue between the characters because they're so alive now. And they're so, I find them very funny. That I think out of the ones who are in the book, my favourite character, it probably has to be Win. He's like a Labrador puppy mixed with a ninja, mixed with a wizard, mixed with a normal boy.
Who could not enjoy writing that? More generally about you as a writer, which part of the writing process is the one that delights you the most?
Oh, well, I plan in a lot of detail. So the plan for The Land of Rule, which is around 50,000 words long, was around 10,000 words long. So it's a lot of plan. I think it's probably a rehearsal for writing it, really. But then when I start writing, there comes a point, the first sort of 3 or 4 chapters are really hard work. It's like we go for a run, you don't want to feel sick for the start. And then it goes off. And it's like you're living the story and you're flying the dragons and it's just thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling. It feels like it's happening to you. My memories feel no different. My real world memories feel no different to my made up fantasy memories from Raw. Obviously, I know that I haven't flown a dragon, but they feel the same. It's absolutely wonderful. So that is the bit I enjoy the most, the actual writing of the story when it's just from nothing, it is appearing in front of you. And I can definitely tell you the hardest bit is editing. Without a doubt, editing is the hardest bit. And it's also the hardest bit for children in school, isn't it, when you see them?
By that, do you mean the editing that you do before you send it to an editor, or that process, the toing and froing?
Well, I suppose when I send it to the editor, I've tried to make it as good as I can possibly make it. There would be, there'll be a lot of versions where I feel like it's at that point. And if it was easy, if I could have done it easily, I would have done it. So when the editor, I've been lucky enough to work with brilliant editors. Just incredible what they are able to do and notice. And the way I describe it is, it's like when you're young and you tidy your bedroom and you shove everything in a cupboard or under the bed, and then your mum comes in and says, "What's this?" Or your dad comes in and discovers everything you've hidden away. So there are always things when you're writing where it's not quite right. It doesn't quite. It could be pushed further. You're not pushing yourself as far as you can go, and then a good editor will nudge you closer and closer, doing the best job you can. And but it's hard.
Yeah, it's interesting. Although I don't do your kind of writing, the writing that I do, I've always found that editing process one of the most enjoyable. That kind of conversation that makes you think again, and that time to rewrite and revisit.
Well, I think it gets really exciting again when it's like pushing a big boulder up a hill. and you don't think you'll be able to do it. I think it's very something quite alone, isn't there, with writing, is that although you get the advice from your editor, essentially now you've got to do it. But then when everything fits together, so I'm about to get probably a third edit with the Return to Raw, and that's going to be the joyful one. The polishing one.
So there's the pain, and then we get the pleasure.
People don't, you don't often hear about. You just imagine books spring out, don't you? Being a big slog.
Yeah, I don't think anybody finds it from beginning to end. I think people find different parts of the process challenging. Yeah. But I don't think anybody finds the whole thing completely straightforward. Well, I've never met them anyway.
I was quite amazed by looking on. I went to the exhibition at the British Library about J.K. Rowling, and there were some of her original handwritten manuscripts that were so close to the final published versions. Incredible.
Amazing.
Writing like that. Yeah.
But of course we don't know what was in her head and how difficult that bit was.
Also, who knows how many other notebooks there were.
Exactly. I must just ask you, just because you have been a teacher, in terms of thinking about encouraging young writers in the classroom, any top tips that you'd like to pass on to other teachers?
Well, there are a huge amount of pressures on teachers now, even more so than when I was teaching. There might be what you have to do, might be quite different to what you want to do and know is the right thing to do. I can remember really clearly when the Year 9 SATs existed, having to do things that I didn't sit comfortably with what I knew was going to help the children become good writers. So teachers are very clever though. They think up brilliant ways of getting these things into the classroom, and there is really nothing like free writing where you encourage children not to care about anything, spellings, full stops, anything, just to write for the sheer joy of writing. Because to be honest, that's how I write. I'm not thinking at all about those things when I write. And also not constantly revising a piece of work. I think there should just be a place for writing, and that's it. You've done it. And then obviously there are pieces you work on and you improve, and that's an interesting and satisfying process. But then just having that space, if that can be found, it's so difficult. There's so many things that teachers are expected to do.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.